Hey friends, this is a podcast run by a software engineer. I am Perry Tiu, and on this episode I get to talk to Camryn Leibowitz, co-founder of Royce and Rocket, a travel luxury suitcase brand with a very interesting shelving design. On this episode you'll hear her talk about how she ended up in the Washington Post, the origin behind the name Royce and Rocket, and much more. Before we get into all of that, don't forget to hit the follow button on Spotify and Apple Podcasts so you know when the new episodes are available. All the podcast links can be found at perrytiu.com/podcast. Oh, and there's also new merch that just dropped at perrytiu.com/shop. Go check it out. Anyways, on to the show. Welcome back to another episode of a podcast run by a software engineer. I'm the host Perry, and today we have Camryn on the show. Camryn, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's so great that in terms of how we met, it's something that nobody really intentionally does, which is quite funny because we have these events that we're currently based in New York at the moment, and there's these kind of weekly tech events or even monthly tech events, and during that time there's a lot of interesting people. There's co-founders, there's tech people that are building software, the people who just work in business at that time, and that's actually one place where we bumped into, and that's when you kind of told me about your project and your story. People have seen the title, Royce and Rockets. It sounds exciting, but extremely happy to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
One thing that, before we get into the whole fun part in terms of what you do nowadays, but also the influences that really affected the decisions you made throughout the whole way, who is Camryn? You want to share a bit, maybe high level, 30 seconds something on, who Camryn is?
Yeah, so I grew up moving between London and New Jersey. We moved 6 times before I turned 12. So I'd say I'm really from somewhere over the mid-Atlantic. It was pretty much nonstop. From there, we settled in New Jersey. I went to high school, then I went to college. I went to Georgetown where I studied international relations and Russian. And I think my life has come to be defined now by Royce and Rocket. My junior year of college, my mom and I had this concept, came up with the idea for the suitcase, and that has been my sole focus ever since, and that was in 2019.
That's really exciting because one thing that I do enjoy hearing from the guests is of course, podcast run by a software engineer, I dive way too much into the tech and the whole deep world. But there's also so much business, right? Business background behind everything you're doing, and that's something for me. I use these as an excuse to learn stuff from the guests, but also to be like, oh, that is really cool, and then how you apply to all of it. One thing that's quite funny when I'm saying living maybe somewhere in between the ocean, all that kind of stuff. I'm not gonna dive into this, but if a baby is born on an airplane in the middle of the ocean,
that is a really good point.
That is one that I don't know. Is it the destination that is your nationality, or is it?
It's a really interesting citizenship question. I'm sure this happens all the time.
Yeah. Well, if they allow...
Not all the time. Maybe not all the time, but every now and again. So there has to be an answer.
No, of course, right.
Yeah.
Or who's the person who's allowing a really late pregnancy woman on the plane at the moment?
That is also a really good point.
I know. Anyways, that's what we're going to be talking about for the next hour, so no, I'm kidding on that. But regardless, I am actually excited to hear about all the stories because, of course, your experience of not only 2 different environments of the Americas versus the England and all that kind of stuff, but also just being very hands-on with your project nowadays. But we want to figure out how you got to there. One thing that people are really, love hearing about people talk about is home, right? People have different homes, but also it affects how they grow up. So maybe from your perspective, what is home to Camryn?
Yeah, so home is definitely my family. Growing up in 2 different places, my idea of home became tied to them rather than a house in the most typical sense. I have a really close bond with my brothers because of it. We are definitely, I would even say, culturally different in that we moved back permanently to the States when I was 12, other brother was 10, and the third one was 8. So they're a bit more American than I am, even with that being said, but that cross-cultural upbringing is something that I know that they understand. Nowadays, I am 25. I'm not living with my family anymore. And home for me, I think, has become more of a set of values and ideas and the people who that resonates with.
Yeah, I think that is kind of the definition of a home, other than the actual structure. But when we're talking about home, is really influences around you, right? You suck up so much from the environment you're in. And the fact that you're saying home, regardless of where you're born, it's the people that's around it.
100%.
And that's kind of why when you're talking about these relationships with family, it's super important because when you talk about growing up with hopefully a healthy family, nobody ever takes it for granted, but it seems that I keep on referring to toys, as in growing up during the whole childhood, that's the whole point of playing with toys. The only thing I'm saying about that is because nowadays you do get to be very hands-on with your product, your travel project, which is absolutely sick. And it's quite funny that I mentioned since you move around so much, and maybe all that actually came together at some point.
100%.
But anything you remember back then in terms of what did you play a lot with? For example, when I grew up, like the Nintendo 64 was pretty much up there. We had a lot of Monopoly was great, and not saying that it defined my career as a software engineer at the end of the day, but I do remember a lot of those questions that are coming up. You're like, oh wait, why can't you buy this for Monopoly, blah, blah, blah. And then it's like a lot of thinking during that. So any kind of like memorable toys or anything, objects or gadgets that you used to play back then, you or with your siblings that, looking back, may have actually helped you throughout this whole journey so far?
I had a very complicated relationship with toys. I would destroy them. I was gifted a bunch of baby dolls, and my mom came home one day and I had painted all over them, and not in like a cute artistic way, like they were covered in like black and red paint. So I don't know if I don't have a lot of memories of strictly like playing when I was younger. I really liked reading. Mm-hmm. For my 7th birthday, I really wanted a microscope, so I got a microscope. And I, as a 7-year-old, would like walk around with cotton swabs and like swab things and put them on my slides and look at them through a microscope. I remember always being very like engaged with the world, but it was more so I liked talking and reading.
Even at a young age, though.
Yeah.
I'm saying this because people think I talk a lot like my whole life, but as a kid, I was
insane. I couldn't shut up.
For me, it was the opposite. I was like, I don't know anything about the varsity. I don't want to say anything, but at some point, like, you don't really miss out on saying things, right? Like, the whole point is that the word is out there, and if you have a message, just say it at some point. So for me, it was a night and day thing, where at some point I was like, wait, I talk a lot now. Do you know what I mean? It was just a switch, but it was so cool to hear from you that, like, even having that experience, I keep on saying experience, but even being comfortable with the fact that you're able to share your ideas from a young age, I wish.
We were also moving a lot, right? So
True.
I remember nothing ever fully made sense. There was always a million questions. Every time we moved, everything got redefined. So when I think about my childhood, like I think about really trying to figure out what's going on and how things work in the new places that we're going to. I'm sure if we asked my mother, she would say that I played with a bunch of things. The only thing I can remember is these baby dolls that I painted all over.
Right, yeah. I'm sure they're still somewhere. They're always
No,
stuck
I
in
think
there
she
somewhere.
threw them out immediately. She was like, why did you do that?
I mean, she's going to bring it out during your wedding, and then they'll be like, do you remember these little things? Anyways,
please, no.
Whenever that comes up. But one of the geekier questions that I keep on asking, I love asking, is our lives are influenced by technology at some point. Computers, phones, and all that. Maybe the root of it. Do you remember when's the first time you got exposed to a computer or like got exposed to a phone or anything like that? Just because I know for me, the life was Windows 95 and like Windows 98, and then next thing you know, my dad was very hands-on, like building random stuff together. They weren't always reliable. They would just like die at some point. But maybe from your end, do you remember anything particular in that techie world from back then?
I have 2 very clear memories of my first interactions with a computer and a camera phone, like a flip camera phone. We had a computer, one of those old Windows computers with the classic desktop and everything, and my mom would allow my brothers and I certain allotted times throughout the day that we could use it, and that sat like in a specific room, and I thought it was the coolest thing. And I remember seeing a flip phone and trying to show my mom how to use it. One thing that I think is so interesting is even as a kid, and I wonder if you had the same experience, I always found technology very intuitive, more so than my parents did, especially in understanding how it works and being able to adapt to it. So I don't know, did you have a similar experience with that?
I'm so glad you pointed that in the sense of like, when people give you a gadget, somehow you find your way to
figure it out.
Right?
And it's something I always wonder if, I don't know, I work with my mom. So whenever there's a new type of technology or a new app, it takes her a minute to figure out how to use it, whereas I feel like for me, most of the time, it's pretty intuitive, or at least I can figure it out. And I always wonder, when I am like 55, is it still going to be as intuitive, or does that dynamic just replicate with the second generation?
It's a great question, because I remember talking about this at some other podcasts where there's 2 parts to it. Number one is in the sense of the people who make these products, these manufacturers, they do research to make it easy for the user, right? And the reason why we have, like for example, the computer programs at the moment, the reason why it's quite intuitive is because people thought about, hey, I'm a user, how to use it. Back then, everything was just on a terminal. So even if you want to go to a website or whatever, you have to go to the terminal and type everything. And that was just not intuitive. And that's why they were like, we have to build GUIs, graphical UIs and all that. But if you think about objects at the end of the day, it's the same concept where if you're not able to figure out the object with minimal instruction, then it's not very well designed. So I feel like there's one part of it is like the people making the objects, and then the other part is that maybe the newer generation, us or whatever it is, have just a different way of looking at the world, right? Like we don't really deal with candles anymore. Well, like for lighting the rooms at least.
I love candles.
Some people do still do that, but it's not the reliable thing at the end. But some of those examples is really cool to think about in the sense of like there are people putting the effort to make it very easy to use, but also how we see the world nowadays. It's gonna be different as you're saying in like 50 years or whatever it is. People be like, oh, it's so easy to use this like hologram to like just project yourself onto here and then you just like teleport there. It's like, no, I'm not gonna get that. I'm not gonna.
But is that interface going to be challenging for us to use?
That's a great question. I don't know. I feel like, I mean, people are very intuitive with phones nowadays.
Right.
Which is great.
Is it because we grew up with it?
I think there's something where if something you use it consistently, daily, for a good period of time, no matter how complicated it is, the human brain should adapt to that. Should. That's the key word in all this stuff. But no, that's the one thing about gadgets and everything, because I do know that it does help because nowadays we are surrounded by gadgets. We use it day to day, and we could talk about your working flow in terms of what's your favorite application that makes your day run by, right? And that's kind of where I was talking about these tools growing up. But at some point we kind of talk about like other influences as a child and everything. Did you have any like hobbies growing up? Do you remember like if you ever played or you did any chess club or any kind of clubs where it's like here's some piece and you could build robots out of it? Was there any like activities like that stood out?
Perry, I built suitcases. I do not do software. I was not in any robotics club. Cut that out. Like no.
Me neither, to be fair.
Cut that out. Okay. Honestly, my hobbies as a child, I was very into school and I really liked reading and learning, but from an extracurricular standpoint, there was nothing I was super passionate about. I was involved in a lot of things. Nothing excited me as much as traveling did, as much as conversations did. Culture was always my favorite thing and there was no way to really engage with that. I was really into current affairs. I had like from my mom got me, it was called Newsendemic. It was bi-monthly. It was like 20 pages and it was a newspaper for kids. And it was my favorite thing and I read it religiously. So we would like go out to dinner and it would be like my mom, my dad, and their friends. And I'd be like, oh, like, did you hear about the Lahore? Like,
oh my goodness, right.
Truly. But that was really where I was at. I think I've always been more idea focused than hands-on, which is why product design really came at me in a very strong way because I didn't expect it. I didn't expect it to be something that I could excel at or even be interested in. I studied international relations. It's the understanding of the mind and negotiation, and it's all very heady in a way that isn't.
No, of course, because I mean, like, this is the preview to all of it, as you're saying, like, being able to just absorb information, because the whole thing that I understand from childhood, at least my childhood, is that you're absorbing stuff.
Right.
And sometimes you don't get to choose what you absorb, but when you're exposed to this, when you talk about this Newsweek and these, like, current affairs and everything, like, sure, being exposed to that is a beginning, but it's a weekly, I'm assuming it's like a weekly issue, where every time you just have a bigger breadth of knowledge, that's how I describe it, just a bigger and bigger breadth of knowledge every time at such a young age, and then at some point you'll be like, loads of ideas. Of course, everybody goes through an idea phase, but you are a clear example today of applying ideas and making it into tangible products at the end, which is very hard for a lot of people to come by. People have a million ideas, but the difference between having ideas and making it's a significant difference at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
But I'm glad you mentioned also in terms of education in that, because that has a big impact. Of course, as a kid, you get exposed to life, daily hobbies, people around you, influences, but there's also a bit of structure if you go through the education system, and that really tailors it. Talking about business, I don't think there were business classes in like elementary school or anything like that though, but in terms of, really quickly, some decisions, at least for me in high school, like do I go into sciences, do I go into history, all that kind of stuff. Maybe you want to deep dive into that in terms of, what do you make of your, I guess, like early education in terms of elementary school, secondary school, however you want it? Were there any particular moments you were like, I'm glad I did this AP class or equivalent of AP class somewhere? Anything that stood out during that time?
So, as I mentioned before, we were moving back and forth. when I was in the UK, I was in the English school system. When I was in the States, I was in the American school system, and it never matched up, right? So I arrived in the UK in second grade, and I had gotten tutored the whole summer before to be ready for what they knew. Because the British school system in those elementary school years moves a lot quicker. I remember in like my second week of school, I had spent the whole summer learning multiplication, okay? So I was like ready to whip out my like 2 times 2. And they give us this test. And the last question, I'll never forget it. It was all the multiplication. I was like, yeah, like got it. And the last question was 8 divided by 0. And I think I wrote like 75. Like I had no idea what that looked like. So it was really interesting because in one place I was top of my class. In another place I had no idea what a division sign was. So it, I guess, really taught me to understand like narrative and perspective on things more so than anything.
Yeah, because a lot of that is like you get thrown these questions or you get thrown these problems, and like even at a young age it's not fair at the end of the day. No matter what, it's not fair. But then taking from that is that you make the connection that there's just 2 different systems. Right? For me, that I've studied my whole life in Canada, I just assumed it was one system, but then somebody told me like, oh yeah, we don't have like high schools, middle schools and all that. In Canada, it's just like you have elementary school, secondary school, but that only goes up to grade 11, and then grade 12 in your first year of university, you have this own little like another school you go to, and then you go into university, which is 3 years for us instead of 4. And if I'm from Montreal and I stay in Montreal, that's the only thing I would know. I wouldn't know any other system. But once obviously you talk to more people and you move out, I'm sure your experience at Georgetown University, we could talk about that in a second. It's not this whole like only 3 years university, and it's not because you went to a CGIP. We called it CGIP the 2 years before. It's very close to the English system, now that I think about it. So the fact that you're already, you know the difference between that already has an impact to it, and the fact that you can't compare in terms of what you know and what you don't know. I didn't know you need to know that. I didn't know you needed to know division during that time. But one thing that's actually really cool, because we talk about a lot of math and a lot of sciences and everything, but if we take all of that and we go into more, I guess, the business side, and at some point where you have to like think about how to apply it and all that, was there ever like a choice given to you in school to, or at least on the high school, middle school phase? Of course, university you get to choose a program, but maybe towards the later ends of your high school, was there ever an opportunity for you to be choosing more classes tailored into what you want to go into?
There were 2 classes. The first was econ, and then the second was called 20th Century World. That kind of lent into what I wanted to do in university. Economics, we had no other classes of it. I was able to take it senior year for 1 semester. And just understanding that, understanding business even from such a theoretical place, really set off some light bulbs for me, and I really enjoyed it. And the second class, 20th Century World, it was looking into philosophical texts that were like the canon of 20th century literature and discussing them in a very, I guess I would say, mature way, which we didn't have any other options to do in high school.
Yeah, and because you mentioned senior, because the thing is like senior is a weird term for Canadians to be like, what is a senior? But anyways, even that decision in high school where you get to choose these classes, econ and 20th century world views and all that, that eventually led into your path in university at that time. So where did you go into university to begin with?
So I went to Georgetown University. I was in their School of Foreign Service, and I always knew I wanted to do international relations. That became very clear to me. As you asked before, like what were your hobbies when you were a kid? Like truly, like culture has always been my hobby. Culture has always been my like one true obsession and love. And being able to expand on that and learn about it in a more formal sense was something that really excited me.
No, that's super great to know, because before anything, Georgetown, is that Bulldogs?
Yeah.
Okay, just double checking. There's something in my mind where every time you said it, I was like, yeah, it's a Navy-ish Bulldog. I'm so good. Anyways, I'm just like giving myself a pat on the back on that. International relations, in terms of that being a major, I have a million questions for that, mostly because very anecdotally, growing up in Montreal, people going into university, there's literally the 2 most popular paths. It was psychology and then business major. Those are literally the 2 most. If I look back at all the friends I have, 80% of them went half and half on psychology and then business. But this is considered a business degree, right? When we talk about international relations, we're talking about...
It's not a business degree.
Gotcha. How would you frame that in that case, international relations? You would consider that more like a...
So we received a Bachelor of Science, actually.
Oh, wow, okay. See, this is something that I definitely needed to clarify because I didn't take that for granted, so go ahead.
Yeah, so we received a Bachelor of Science. There is like a heavy econ load, but there are no business classes.
But yeah, usually when we get into computer science, first year is always going to be something like intro to programming, whereas like here's a computer language, here's what it does. So from your experience when you went through that degree, what did the first semester look like, and was it your expectation actually of going into that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously your first year is a lot of introductory classes. So I remember doing like intro to econ. They also, the SFS does something really cool where as a freshman, you're required to take one of these small seminar classes. And I ended up taking one on Africa and refugees. I ended up studying for the whole semester, like the refugee crisis in Western Africa. Super, super interesting. And I remember taking that class and thinking, like, this is why I came to this school. I also decided that I would be taking Russian. I took Russian every single day of my time at Georgetown. I was in a Russian class for at least 1 hour. So freshman year, I think my main memory is trying to learn Cyrillic. But yeah, that's what it looks like. I mean, it's econ, it's philosophy, it's language, and some higher level classes, and history as well.
Now I feel like everything that you mentioned really drives a lot of, I guess, important pillars of societies nowadays.
Yeah.
If you think about it, like anything about the philosophies and like the fact that the econ behind it, like the politics nowadays, the banking infrastructure, any kind of like communication between countries, like if those are not, I guess, explored upon, it doesn't go well at the end of the day. So I already see that there's like, when you're talking about these intro, you really do start diving deeper into that world to begin with.
Yeah.
And then, I don't know if you noticed, but the more you're talking about it, the more it really reflects the part where you really do appreciate education, you really appreciate learning new things, because not saying that I took education for granted, which nobody ever should, but sometimes when you get to university, you're like, why am I here? Why am I doing that? But it really sounds like the opposite for you, where every day
I loved it.
is something like that.
I loved it. And I wasn't great at school, nor did I give it my full attention. I've never been a grades person. I probably should have, I was going to say I've never really cared, but I guess I should say I probably should have cared more.
Tell me about it.
Right. But I was fascinated by it. I feel really grateful for my time at Georgetown and the path I ended up taking. I wanted to study business. Here's a funny story. I wanted to study business, and there is a dual degree program between the business school and the foreign service school called Global Business. It makes sense. And you apply into it your sophomore year, and I did not get in because of my Russian grades. So I ended up having to study Science, Technology, and International Affairs, which I did not want to do, but it allowed me to still take some business courses, and it was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. I have never been so mentally excited as I have been sitting in some of those classes. I mean, it was just the coolest thing. Yeah, I would go back any day.
Yeah, I mean, the passion speaks for itself at that point. I think there's two main questions that kind of came out of that I'm really curious about. Number one, Georgetown, which state is that in?
It's in D.C.
It's in D.C., gotcha.
Yeah.
Clearly, I'm terrible with. Is it the first time that you were living in D.C., or did you live there previously?
Yes, first time I was living there. I have some family who are right outside D.C., so I'd been, but no, I'd never lived there before.
And that's great.
Amazing. It was I don't know if I would move back, but it is the best place to go to college, and I truly believe that. Because and Georgetown, GW, American, I think it's all a similar experience. Georgetown is, people say it's the Georgetown bubble because you enter it and you really have no reason to leave. But if you do leave, you have the entire city at your disposal. And when you're studying something like international relations, being able to be like, oh, this is the White House, it's about a 20-minute walk away, is mind-blowing. I mean, I studied Russian for 4 years. My freshman year, we got invited to watch a movie showing at the Russian embassy. And just being able to feel like you are learning something, and even though it is so theoretical and non-physical, that the things about it that you can touch are right down the street, it was so cool.
I couldn't have said it better myself, because the fact that when I had to clarify where is this located, the surrounding is just as important as like being on the campus.
And it also allows them to get, there's so many people in politics in DC, obviously, and so the faculty and the adjunct staff is amazing, because they'll pull in people who are,
in the field, right?
Yes,
like
yes.
in that industry, as they call it.
And want to be in DC anyways, or living there regardless. And now they're teaching a class at Georgetown, and you're sitting there with the old director of science, and you're like, okay.
Sure, yeah.
Let's
They're
do
very
this.
casually there, right?
Yes.
You assume they just live there at that point, and like.
Oh, it's amazing.
And that's why I love hearing these bits of story, because like maybe for the people who did go to university, there's the classes, but a lot of times you also have these like extra once in a while. You either get to visit somewhere, as you were saying, or they have people from specific industry that kind of come to talk to your class. One anecdote if you didn't know, Montreal is very game industry heavy.
Yes.
So all the Ubisoft, Rockstar, like a lot of people, Square Enix are out there. So they would bring people from those companies to come in to talk, into the techie way, to be like, here's how you build games and everything. I didn't end up going into the gaming industry at the end, but this is the parallel I'm trying to make, that the surrounding of where Georgetown was for that area was so relevant to that.
Absolutely. And I just thought of an example for you. I took this class my sophomore year. So my freshman year, Trump got elected, which was, in the world of international relations, at least at Georgetown, it was, the rest of the semester was, these are the rules of how the world works. We have done this for 50 years, and up until literally last month, this is what we thought would continue happening, and now we don't know what to say. So in the wake of that, my sophomore year, this amazing professor, she went by her first name, Maggie, she started a class called Social Media and Democracy. So this was right at the time when everyone realized the impact Facebook was having on the election, and was having on our politics. And so it was the vanguard of what people were thinking at the time. And so this class dived into and taught me the language to understand how social media, which then and even now was such a new idea and a new influence on society, was having these incredible effects. Like, I remember learning the word echo chamber, not groupthink, right, but echo chamber, and how that was manifesting on people's news feeds. And we went through this entire class, and at the end of the class, she had the CFO of Facebook come and talk to us.
Hey, no way.
Yeah, it was amazing. And he was like, he didn't answer many questions directly, but it was incredible. And she was able to do that because we were based in DC, and he was there.
Yeah, and those are the stuff where you don't ask for them, right? You don't ask, can we please have a what? It's just
you
stuff
wouldn't
that
even
happens.
know how. I didn't even know I needed to know this. I didn't know how to ask for that. And looking at like a bunch of classes and being like, oh, that sounds really cool. Like, let's see. And it just turned out incredible. I will never forget that. I really liked her.
No, if anything, that's a great story. I'm so glad that you shared those kind of stuff, because I mean, like, if I think back in terms of how that works, but even some of the terms that you were mentioning in terms of like the rules of the world, like, or even like these echo chambers, like those are terms that like we kind of know what it is, but when you're kind of living it as it evolves, as it happens,
right.
It's like it marks you, and then the fact that you can go through the experience and then just move on and do something with it at some point, that's usually what like I love exploring and love hearing guests talk about more than anything.
Right.
One thing that's really cool with all of this is that I'm sure during that time you meet loads of people, right? You meet loads of people during the years at Georgetown, whether there were other students or even just people living around there. If we talk about maybe something like internships or any jobs during that time or any projects that you participated while you were at Georgetown, did you get yourself into any of the clubs or anything like that? Or
Yes, so I was at a few. One of them, a lot of my projects at Georgetown I've always been quite entrepreneurial. So for example, as a result of the class that I just explained to you, I started a clothing line. And the whole idea was taking politics out of social media and wearing it, because what billboard could be more true than your clothing? It was as a result, it was in response to the Parkland shooting in 2017. And I made all these shirts that had this graphic, because at the time people kept saying thoughts and prayers aren't enough. So I made all these shirts, and all my friends helped me, and we ended up going to to the rally in DC, because that's where we were, and selling all the shirts. We were in the Washington Post. We sold out. It was wild. But I feel I was always very responsive to the stuff I was learning in that way. I was also a part of the Corp, which is the largest student-run organization in America. And it's a wild thing. Georgetown was such an amazing experience, and such like a bubble away from the rest of the world. So everyone was super motivated. When it came to classes, when it came to extracurriculars, the more involved you were, the cooler it was. So the Corp is the largest student-run organization in North America, and there's a bunch of coffee shops. They have a few mini marts, and I worked at the salad store. So for I think 9 hours a week my freshman year, I was chopping vegetables and making salads.
Well, and that's one way of being involved, if anything, right?
Well, it's actually, Jesuit schools aren't allowed to have Greek life. It's exclusionary. So instead, all of these different, more, I guess, work-based organizations pop up. So it was a social club / job, which no one outside, it's very hard to explain to people.
It really is, honestly. If you mentioned Jesuit school, I did go to Jesuit high school at the end of the day. And there's some similar, there's some stuff that you said that was like, oh, I kind of get it at that point. But that's really cool because the way you were phrasing some of these, it really is, you hear the drive behind it. And what I mean by that is that take politics out of fashion. Like, those are words that, like,
put politics into fashion.
Sorry, I wrote that completely wrong. Put politics into fashion. That's probably what I was trying to say into that. These are very movementful ideas behind that. So in that aspect, was it something that was driven by a course? It wasn't like a course project. It was something like driven by you in that sense. And in terms of what kind of help did you need to do that? Or was it, how did you find out that where to get your t-shirts from, or like where to be at that time? That kind of operation style, that's what I'm obsessed with. That's what I was kind of wondering, like in terms of how did that seedling of idea really turn into a let's do it and have the whole coverage even?
As I said before, I am an ideas person. When I get into an idea, it is very hard for me to let it go, and I will like devour the concept until I can like flush out what I'm looking for from it. So as I said, I took this class and it blew open the whole world of how we communicate with each other and the polarization of America as it stood at the time. And I just kind of had this train of thought, and I remember it was actually, I was on a flight home. I did not have a computer. I did not have any type of technology. My phone had broken on the trip. So all I had was, my friend gave me a notebook and a set of pencils, and I had a 4-hour flight home connecting from Mexico through Atlanta to New York, and like nothing to do. And I just remember like thinking it through again and again and again and again. And I was like, this is so, I still wish I ended up having to stop doing the clothing line, but I really enjoyed it. It, from an operations standpoint, and the concept behind it, which I was just lit on fire by, was the idea that Trump had just gotten elected, no one knew what was going on, and then we had the Parkland shooting, and suddenly there was this 17-year-old Emma Gonzalez speaking about the absolute violence of school shootings to thousands and thousands of people in a way that was so incredibly moving to me, and feeling so helpless in the face of this recent election, I started this clothing line because I didn't really know what else to do. And from an operations standpoint, my thinking on it at the time was, let me get this made super quick, super easy, and if it works out and it's something I want to continue doing, then I will look abroad and I will try to manufacture in a way that's more economical. So at the time, that meant custom ink. I made the t-shirts on custom ink. There's 2 different styles, a t-shirt and a baseball shirt. My friends still wear them. They were actually quite cute, I will say. And they had this really crazy graphic that just got the point across like this. And yeah, I mean, I didn't end up making money from it. I think I made the shirts.
That wasn't the goal either.
That wasn't the goal. I made the shirts for, I think, $15, $20 a shirt, and I sold them for $25, and we packed them up. I remember my poor roommates, we had like an assembly line. We packed them up.
Oh, yeah.
We went down to the Everytown March in Washington, and we sold all the shirts. We sold 200 shirts at this march. I was in the Washington Post. And I ended up doing a fellowship at Georgetown, an ethics lab fellowship out of it. And it was really impactful to me. I spent the summer after that trying to figure out how to actually do it on a broader scale. And then reality hit, and I had to study abroad in Russia, and one thing led to another, and I came to Royce and Rocket. But it's something that is always with me. The name of the brand was Enigma Culture, and it will exist in some form one day. I'm not sure what that means at this time.
I think it's just one of those episodes that the word is helpless. It echoes. There's 2 kinds of people. Either you wait for something to happen, or you do something about it.
I am active to a fault. I cannot help myself no matter the situation. If I can do something to make something better for myself or quell some type of uncomfort in my head, I will do it.
Yeah, and that's why these are the kind of things that drives what you end up doing today, especially the project that you're talking about. Because, I mean, if I look back at myself, like there's a lot of times where I was like, I can't do something about it, but then I didn't end up doing something about it, and I feel bad over the years. But then when you're given this example of being present there and this individual, Emma Gonzalez, driving so much of this effort, and you know that, hey, it's like a rippling effect where once one person does that, then so many people understand the conviction, understand the meaning behind it, and you really took it, in your hands as saying, like, having this whole setup at home to just package everything. You went out of your way is what I'm saying. You could have easily done nothing for that, but one thing that I kept on relating that you mentioned about Georgetown is that it seems that people really are driven, people really are involved in that setting of that. It's not exactly a bubble at this point because it impacts everything. And congratulations on being on the shout out for the Washington Post during that time, which is a pretty massive thing. And then follow up on that. One thing I do want to dive into is that at some point, everybody has their university journey and it comes to an end at some point. And with a, I guess, like field like that in terms of international relations and everything, people can take many paths from there, if that makes any sense, right? And I don't know what's a typical path of somebody coming out of international relations. So maybe from what you remember in terms of, do you remember in terms of the demographics, like who went to what? And then we could dive into after, of course, the path you took from then on.
Yeah. Strangely enough, and actually during my time at Georgetown, they hired a consultant to figure out how to get more of their students more interested in actually going into foreign affairs. It was the minority, I would actually say. Majority of my peers went into consulting, a huge consulting funnel, IB, tech, product managers, more along that route than strictly politics.
No, it actually makes a lot of sense because for me, I would have like zero idea. If you ask me exactly like, what's the typical path of somebody going out of here? Do they go straight into, I guess, being a PM? I wouldn't know that. And the fact that you mentioned it, I think that's really cool. And I'm assuming that when you're talking about consulting, we're talking about like these McKinseys out there and all the other, like maybe the big Deloittes and like big Fours on. That is really, really cool. But what we do want to hear about in terms of your path from that point, because you're an individual who really does take the world, upon yourself in terms of solving stuff, fixing stuff, building stuff, if anything. So maybe from your story then, after graduating from Georgetown, what was the plan? What was not the plan? How did that look like?
What was not the plan was COVID.
Right.
So my last year of college was 2020. So what was not the plan was moving home, but what was always the plan was Royce and Rocket. So even the summer after my junior year, when all of my friends, your junior year internship is the big one and you get a return offer. And I was working with my mom at home trying to figure out how to make a suitcase. So I had known that Royce and Rocket was where I was going. COVID was not the plan. We had always planned on launching 2021, and just because of the disruption in the supply chain and how much longer things were taking, that got pushed and pushed. But I will say something that was interesting is I remember my senior year, everyone getting their jobs before COVID, everyone knew where they were going, things had settled. And people would be like, so Camryn, what are you doing? Where are you working? I'm like, I'm starting a luggage company with my mom. Like, what do you mean? Like, it's a suitcase with shelves. And people were like, okay, like that's really cool. But it was really interesting looking back because that was a bit hard for me. I mean, I've always been a bit of, not an overachiever, but maybe a bit sometimes. And so having that level of instability when all of my friends were walking into jobs at these massive companies was definitely a challenge.
No, I mean, like, even, I think some of the words that come out of it, like the doubt or like the unsettledness and all that, that's why when you have individuals going through that, they sort of come out with even better stories and even more creative side to them. Trust me, like, by the time I graduated, there was never a guaranteed job for me at that point, and it's really creatively. I told you where, after university, I ended up moving to Hong Kong and moving to different places, and it's not part of a plan. Well, not part of my plan. My plan was just living life at that point. But out of that, you get these cool stories. And we're going to obviously jump into Royce and Rockets. That's something that the first time I met you, it's something that you mentioned. And from the second you mentioned that, I was like, I remember what I told you. I was like, Oh, so you do hardware.
Yes, and I now say that all the time.
And then looking back, it was quite funny because I just assumed everybody knew what I was. Everybody knew I was living in Perry's world, if anything.
I was like, what do you mean hardware?
And then I was like, oh wait, sorry, we're around like maybe normal people sometimes. I don't. Anyways, but one thing I do want to hear about, of course, Royce and Rocket. For people that don't know what Royce and Rocket is to begin with, introduce us. What is Royce and Rocket? What is this project that I personally love, but I want everybody to be able to hear about it?
Yeah, so Royce and Rocket is the luggage brand that I started with my mother. Back in 2019, we came up with the concept, and the idea is a suitcase with shelves. So it opens, it's a 40-60 split, it's a normal looking suitcase from the outside, but on the thinner side, you have shelves that fold directly down, and then there are straps that come out which allow the suitcase to be entirely self-supporting. So it's basically a portable wardrobe in a suitcase, and then we sell it along with a slew of travel accessories.
That sounds great in the sense of, my brain usually goes into a couple of different paths over here. There's the operation side to it, and then there's also like the creativity side where it's like, when you're talking about the design, the ideas and all that, and then the other part to be like, we got to make this operation work. Those are like the two places I might just explore a little bit more, if I may, on that.
Please.
But starting very, very briefly in terms of like, the name itself, Royce and Rockets, sometimes it just sounds so good when you say it right, which you do say right at that point. What was the idea behind it? Where did it come from? Or
It's actually a very cheesy story, Perry. We moved around a lot when I was a kid, and we traveled all the time, and it used to make my brothers and I nervous sometimes, naturally. And my mom would tell us about the stories of Royce and Rocket, who just so happened to be at the London Eye right before we moved to London. So they're actually story characters my mom made up.
that is so cute. Like, I don't have a better word for that. Because you made it sound like everybody should already know what Royce and Rocket is, and I was like, wait, what? Like the made up story that you're talking about. And I was like, wait, am I missing something? Is this something as popular as like, I don't know, Cat in the Hat or something?
It was the only people who knew, my mom, my brothers, and I.
No, that honest. Well, it's the best kept secret up until 2019, as far as I could tell, as far as that goes. And then when we're talking about the fledgling idea, the one way that a lot of people that worship in the tech space, which I keep on saying, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak in the garage, Steve Wozniak the one building the other pieces. Not saying that Steve Jobs wasn't doing anything, but that's kind of what we picture in terms of like being founders, being people that create something out of nothing. So what did that instance look like in the sense of the designing phase, or the phase that before you even officially had like an LLC or whatever it is during that period? Do you want to give a bit of description, as a hopeful thing for everyone who are either currently doing it or planning to jump into that?
Yes. If this is I will tell you the actual steps that we took, because I think that could be helpful if someone is considering making their own product. We had the idea. We fashioned a prototype as best as we could, good old-fashioned arts and crafts, like an old suitcase, a staple gun, some pieces of cardboard, and we still have the suitcase actually, just to make sure that the concept was as good in our heads as we thought it would be, and it totally worked. From there, we did a patent search, so we got in touch with a lawyer and made sure that there was nothing like this on the market or already patented, which would, stop us from being able to produce our own. He put us in touch with a prototype maker, and the prototype maker took an already existing suitcase and fashioned shelves into it. And from there, it became all about making sure, okay, yes, we have the prototype and it works. Can we manufacture this in a viable way economically?
That is so methodological. The way I keep on saying is because, number one, it sounds like there was a checklist that you have to go through, but at the same time, my head is like, who made this checklist, in the sense of like, how does one know you need to go through that? So whether, I don't know if it's from experience or you had other stories from somebody else going through that.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I felt the need to say it on the podcast, is that we did not know that it was a checklist. Looking back, it now makes sense, which is why I love to share that with people, because I wish we did know, because it would have made things a bit simpler. The idea itself, our idea, is so incredibly simple that our first thought was, this must already exist. And if it exists, it must be patented, which means we can drop this because we can't make it anyways. So going to do the patent search was just made sense. And from there, where my mom and I we love talking to people, and we really have needed help throughout this whole journey. Neither of us have any background in manufacturing in particular. And so just talking with people and trying to understand what steps came next.
Yeah, and I do agree with you in the sense that like nobody really has all the maps laid ahead for
Right.
you. Nobody knows exactly every stone that you're supposed to step on, and every stone's gonna be secure and you're gonna be fine. That's the exciting part of being a founder. I've never been a founder myself. I've built projects but never followed through enough to them. But
What about the podcast?
okay, fair. The podcast. It's always been a pet project more than anything, but I do
Selling
agree
yourself short.
that it's a building process with all this kind of stuff. But yes, in the part of what is the next step or what is the step I need to take, I like that you're putting in examples that, yeah, it doesn't matter if you have all the answers immediately or not.
We didn't know anything. Like, I can't even begin to tell you, like, when I say we started from nothing, it was nothing. And the world of suitcase manufacturing is quite complicated, especially when you're looking at it from the outside and you're so passionate about a concept. And my mom and I were like, we need this to exist. But how do we get from like our house in New Jersey to these factories in Asia? And how do we communicate this to them? And how do we, it took a lot.
Yeah, and from this whole process, when we think about that kind of stuff, is that till today, it's been a couple of years now, it's not 4 or 5 years that you've been working on that project. There's always different, I guess, like, not pivotal moments, like milestones that you go. Number one is having the prototype, but then it kind of branches out very quickly in the sense of like, do you market it first? Do you make sure that you can produce as many as you can? Or is there any other bits where it's like, do we need more features? Do we need able to add more things before it's ready to go? So do you remember any of this kind of like splitting moment where you have to decide to be like, is this the time to just purely focus on let's market this? Or is this the time to be like, no, we still gotta spend more time building this? Or maybe what kind of timeline did that look like? Did you already have that going after a year where it's like, this is ready to go, run with it? Or
Right, so we were building this during COVID, which took a lot of decisions out of our hands. We wanted to go to market much sooner than we ended up being able to because there were disruptions in our supply chain and shipping was all messed up. We ended up spending way more time than we otherwise would have designing the product. We became perfectionists, I guess, and like really like obsessed over every single aspect, whether that was the color match of the webbing or like the angle at which our suitcase opened. So that whole process was about 2 years actually.
wow, yeah.
Maybe less, a year and a half. And so once we kind of came out of that and decided that it was finally ready, then that was it. It all happened kind of naturally, I would say. There wasn't as much, also mind you, like it was me and my mom, very little experience in this world, and we just wanted to get the product out there.
And I'm glad there was that like natural support, if anything, because when we talk about these projects, like you do say every time that you're a co-founder, right? Like you'll never be able to do this on your own. Not saying that you can. I'm just saying that in this world of even a lot of these projects, it's meant to be, if it's co-founded, it's that you have the support for all of it. For me to think about all this stuff is, you mentioned the word perfectionist, and I keep on using this word because sometimes I see myself to be like, it's not ready, it's not done, but at some point you just gotta rip the band-aid. So maybe for like from your advice, just having been so hands-on with this kind of stuff, I'm sure today you are still making points where it's like, this is good to go, blah blah blah. What is the thought process for you of working on a product? Because you're a unique individual that has a perspective on being able to do this. So what's your take on when is the right call to do it?
It'll just feel right. And then you start thinking about economics and that you need to start selling the product because you need the revenue. And you just hope that those two feelings kind of come at the same time. But really, like for me, and my mom too, we are such perfectionists. And one of the things that really helps us is we'll design a product, we'll get our first sample in, and me or my mom will then use it for like 2 weeks. And during that 2-week time period, we're constantly, like, use it every single day and make our decisions off of that. But it's, as you said, like having that support. I think if it was just me or just my mom, like products would stay in development for a lot longer. But one of us will kind of pull the trigger and say, we have to go to market.
No, that's actually a really great answer, because in all of this, you'll never discard the gut feelings and everything on that.
Right.
Sometimes when you're not talking into a very technical space as well, like where you're going to go be like, this is the KPIs and this is all like, even a lot of the patterns that you were mentioning about like user testing, like we do that for a lot of websites and software, but when you're saying we have to use it daily, we have to have feedback from all that, that is the same concept, just two different products. One is hardware. The other one is software
Right.
at the end of the day. And then the part that really stood out as well in the sense of like, okay, making the call, gut feelings, instincts going into it, ready to go. After that period of design, about a year and a half, 2 years into it, you had options there in terms of how to get it more tested, get the word out, get any of that, I guess, like the next step from that point. What did that phase look like? What did that period look like? And I'm assuming that's that period when that started up until today, basically. Like, there's a lot of how do we market this or how do we reach out to this? Did you already have a couple of ideas in terms of how to put this on Instagram or something else like that?
So we knew we were going to follow a basic D2C go-to-market strategy, but in terms of how to market and explain our product to people, that's something that is evolving every single day. It was actually, I feel like the whole D2C world has really shifted in the past year and a half. So trying to build the ship as we're sailing it, I guess I would say.
Yeah, name me the amount of times I've heard that story of building something as you go, because it does happen. And the thing is, like, if you don't do that, you could hardly catch up with anything else that happens in the world. If I'm not mistaken, DTC, direct to customer.
Good consumer, yeah.
Just to confirm that we're on the same page on that one. And so in that point, one thing that I do geek out a lot actually is websites. Nearly everything has a website nowadays. I'm a website guy. I've spent my whole career just in websites. So from,
you want to help me with mine?
Anytime. I'll say this a million times on that. But yeah, from your take on that, because of course I want to talk about tech all the time and everything.
Yeah.
How did that go? What's the URL for the website? Now that we could plug that in real quickly. It was
RoyceandRocket.com?
Exactly, RoyceandRocket.com. So tell me more about that in the sense of like, at what point did you need a website or you wanted a website, or how did that get built, or what did that look like?
Just because I think you'll find it interesting. We started with Instagram, and we had a social media presence before we had a website. Our website, was live, I think, 3 or 4 months before we had product here. It started out, as you probably know, getting a very, website, you can, sometimes elegant solutions with websites, elegant, inexpensive solutions are just as effective as incredibly expensive ones. So we, just being bootstrapped, we went the simple route. And we're on Shopify. We got hooked up through some friends with a dev team out in Bulgaria, and they built this site for us, and it was beautiful. And then it broke. We're in our second rendition of the website now, about to be in the third. But it's one of those things, and I'm curious what you think. Something I struggle with. From a design perspective, I am very simple. I like very elegant. I like coherence, right? And my gut instincts with websites from a conversion standpoint are not always correct. So for me, it has been a constant conversation with developers, with e-com nerds who are just geek out over conversion. Yep. And my, I guess, aesthetic instinct, trying to balance all three and figure out how to make it work effectively. But yeah, we're doing a third iteration of the site right now.
No, that's great. And I like how you were posing the question in the sense of what is the direction? What is the answer to it?
Right. Well, this was something that was really interesting, and something I've struggled with is that I am an instinct person, first and foremost, and I always trust my gut feelings. But when it came to building a site, I was continually wrong. So for me, that whole space was about accepting and looking for help.
Honestly, I think it's once you are aware of it, you already solved a good chunk of the problem, right? Yeah. There's a point where you could go so deep into it and you just never realized it was a thing. For me, at least how I see it, if you wanted a 30-second Perry's take on this,
please.
You get away with so much with instinct at the beginning, mid-stage, right? And that's what the drive is. That's why there's so many passionate people with the projects that they start with. You get away with so much with instinct because it works. But then when you get to more the corporate side, once you have way more involvement on that, that's when people throw out the word KPIs and even the word conversion. You mentioned that already. It's not even an instinct, it's a good metric, as they call it. And depending on what your product is, conversion could be actually purchasing. But then there's other type of conversion to be if you have the indirect ones to be we have just way more exposure, so many more people that has onto it. Those are other numbers that you can look into. So once you get into that world, then there's a lot more methods. You can do A/B testing. You could be what if, it's a little bit harder. Exactly. So I think no matter how far you get into that, nobody has a perfect answer to be like, this is the best call, this is not the best call. But the fact that those exist and the fact that you do know they exist and you leveraging them as you go, that is kind of the direction that you should just guide yourself. You don't have to stick to it down to the T, but it's just getting yourself like hands-on. You know about them, get yourself hands-on, and just keep on going with that. Because my day-to-day, like in terms of working with these conversion, it's more on the same thing. It's instead of selling like a suitcase, we're just selling like passes on WeWork, for example.
Right.
So that's it's a different product, but the same thoughts that you have to be like, wait, I thought it would have been better if we move this thing lower into the page, but turns out no, you just put it higher and it should work.
Right.
At the end of the day.
And for me, especially with websites and marketing, I had no experience, and there are actually so many hard rules, right? Like we just built a landing page, and we have a chart that's like, benefits of Royce and Rocket on the left, and then like, some messy suitcases on the right to show how much easier it is to travel with our suitcases. And when we first saw it, we were like, oh, can you flip it? Like, can you do before and after? Like before and after Royce and Rocket, messy suitcases on the left, us on the right. And they were like, well, actually, it's way better, we find, if you put your benefits on the left instead of on the right. And it's one of those things, it's so counterintuitive. And I've been finding this time and time again in marketing. And I think if I was able to put 100% of my time into learning ecom, I would be in a very different spot. But obviously, I can't do that. And so there are continually these things that I'm like, oh wow, okay, I had no idea. And it's really cool, and it's really, I love it. I am really lucky to have some people that I can work with who are so smart and spend all of their time thinking about this stuff. And it's such an interesting field because it's constantly evolving, because testing is so easy. So you're learning these new things all the time, and
No, and that's why this is, like, hearing you say that and hearing you living that adventure and keep on living that adventure, it's something that I wish, I came out saying I'm jealous. I'm jealous on the sense of like, sure, my work relates to that, but it's something in terms of like being able to be behind the project and being able to found it and really do all of it. Right. That's the difference.
Why couldn't you do that?
I don't know. I'm not gonna.
Of course you can. Look, you have this whole podcast.
I don't. To be fair, you're 100% correct. You're 100% correct on all of that. But it's something that hearing it just somebody say it that way, I think it's so cool. Mostly in the sense that when we talk about e-com, it's nobody ever has solved it, but there is a whole industry behind it, and that's why
whole industry.
The getting the insight, the resources, the Google Analytics out there, and all the other ones behind that is super helpful. A lot of the things that you spoke about reflects on what you do today. If we talk about the state of Royce and Rocket today, it's at a stage where, I mean, I'm sure you've been proud of it since day one, but every day since then you've been even prouder. You, your mother, everybody involved in that project has been more. So in terms of where are we taking it from here? I think that's one of the things that I really love hearing about. Of course, we discussed a bit in terms of like the ideation phase and then the stage after ideation, how you reach out, how you leverage all these tools. You start off as Instagram and then starting to build out these websites and getting more reach, but moving forward, where we go from here, it's a very vast question because it could be product-wise in terms of like, are you making any new improvements in the product, or it could be like, where are you bringing the product to at the end? So it's a very open-ended question for you to.
Well, I'm going to answer all aspects of this question, and I'm very excited about it. So, in the immediate, we have a store on the Upper East Side. If you're listening, October, November, we will be there, so come through. We're really excited about it. So, in the immediate, continuing to develop Royce and Rocket as a lifestyle brand and what that looks like, and thinking about what it means for someone to be able to walk into a Royce and Rocket space. In a secondary, I guess, 5 to 10 year plan, I love product design, and I wish I could sit here and say that suitcase was me. It was not. It was my mother. This woman has raised me. I have known her my whole life. She is a genius when it comes to designing products. So on a 5-year thing, I would love to build something that allows my mother to continue designing products at the level that I know she can. And I just want everyone to be able to use them because they are incredible. She is focused on 2 things, okay? Efficiency and aesthetic. And so all of these products that we are putting out will make your life easier and also make it more beautiful. What more could anyone want? So that. And then on a broader scale, okay, I have like a love affair with products and hardware, I guess. And I never thought that I would be here because I've always been an ideas person, as we've talked about. So obviously I have to put ideas and hardware together. And for me, that means that if women were more in product design, then the Dyson Airwrap would have existed years ago. Basically just that women, I feel like, for so many products are the ones that interact with them on a daily basis, and yet there haven't historically been women in the room. Why not? I actually found out the other day that the inventor of the wheeled suitcase, okay, it is credited to some man back in the late 1800s. He's the one that patented it, but it was a woman. And it is a secret history, and I had no idea. And so really just continuing to double down on the female perspective when it comes to daily objects is something that is incredibly important to me. And I cannot wait till I can hire more people and have more people involved in this, because it will be brilliant.
I can't disagree with any of that at the end of the day. If we're seeing that historically, we've been neglecting so much point of views and so many ideas, and you're telling me now is the time we're finding it out, we've been missing out on a lot of things.
100%.
So this is so passionate, and I think that's something that I absolutely love hearing from people. And even one thing that was really cool of you thinking about is just giving the people to be able to workshop and be able to do what they love at the end of the day. It's giving somebody an object is good. I treat it as a one-time thing, but giving somebody the ability to build more and do that's something that is always infinite. It's like teaching somebody how to ride a bike, as you're mentioning. Like, it's a gift for life at that point. So really, really cool from hearing you say that at that point. But one thing I do want to make sure that people do hear as well is any advices for people going through this journey, regardless if there's somebody coming out of school, somebody in school, somebody already years into the industry. They're like, what? I mean, of course you described a lot of reasons of ups and downs and all that kind of stuff, but yeah, anybody that is listening at the point in terms of advices, encouragement, what do you want to tell them?
Faith over fear. Trust your gut. If something is meant for you, it will be for you, and it won't be easy. That's not what that means. It means that if you fight for it, you will get it. My second bit of advice was find your community and find the people who will take this journey with you, because when your faith wavers, you will need them there. I think it's something I take for granted because I work with my mom, and it's such a natural thing for us to be there for each other, but it's really important.
I'm writing all that down. But no, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I guess from that space or all of that, where could people find you, or where could people find Royce and Rocket? Any links, anything you want to share out there?
Yeah, royceandrocket.com, and we are Royce and Rocket on Instagram, on TikTok, not really on Twitter, and then I'm Camryn Leibowitz. You can find me on Instagram at CamLeibo, and that's about it.
And they're all going to be linked over here. So I think, once again, thank you so much for being on the show. I've learned so much of it, and this is my pleasure more than anything, and I hope a lot of people also learn. But I can't say it a million times. Thanks again for being on the show, Camryn.
Thank you so much for having me, Perry. This was so fun.
Honestly, I could have just sat there for another 2 hours just listening to her stories. But either way, I just say thank you again to Camryn for being on the show. If you guys want to follow any of her projects, any of her links, you can find them at perrytiu.com/podcast. Look for episode number 35. Once again, do follow the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, any of your favorite streaming platform. It's completely free. And if you do want to pick up some merch, they are available at perrytiu.com/shop. Thank you for listening to Podcast Room by Software Engineer, and I'll catch you on the next one. Big love.